In this video, we'll be taking a look at the variety of uniforms seen throughout the Wrath of Khan era, as established by costume designer Robert Fletcher and carried forward by his successors. This isn't a deep dive into any one costume. There were so many amazing costumes, and we could literally spend hours poring over each of them. Instead, this is more of a broader look at the overall uniform paradigm, why they were the way they were, and how each fits into the larger whole. On the surface, the uniforms for the Wrath of Khan were a major visual shift from those we saw in the motion picture, but this was only one facet of an overall different creative direction chosen for the sequel, which permeated pretty much every aspect of the movie. Best said in the words of the filmmakers and production team themselves. In the Blu-ray audio commentary, director Nicholas Meyer said, "I related to the television series when I suddenly began to think of it as the adventures of Captain Horatio Hornblower in outer space. Once I got that, I thought, okay, so this is about the Navy. This is about gunboat diplomacy. And I grew up loving those books. And so I redesigned the uniforms, or caused them to be redesigned, and I made them more militaristic." In the book The Making of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan by Alan Asherman, he said, "I said I'd really like to stretch the nautical analogy. It should be like The Prisoner of Zenda, or Captain Horatio Hornblower in outer space. I made everyone on the set watch the movie version of Hornblower. And it was interesting because when I first spoke to Bill Shatner about that, he said that was also Gene Roddenberry's original take on Star Trek. I actually, surprisingly, don't own that book, but it was quoted in Star Trek Costumes: 5 Decades of Fashion from the Final Frontier. I assume the quote is accurate. And in the September 2002 issue of Star Trek the magazine, he said, "I decided that this was going to be Hornblower in outer space, so I said, okay, if this is going to be the Navy, let's have them look like the Navy. They shouldn't be walking around in pajamas," which seemed to me to be what the uniforms in the first movie and the TV show looked like. When you're dealing with me, I think you're dealing with a very flat-footed, earthbound sensibility, and if I didn't understand why they were wearing something, then I just wanted to do it in a way that made sense to me. In Cinema Fantastique Volume 12, costume designer Robert Fletcher said, "The uniforms in the last movie weren't military enough to suit me. Roddenberry always contended that the Federation is not a military organization, yet the crew always behaved as if it were. They have ranks, they have military courtesy, and Kirk is definitely in command on his ship." This was also quoted in Star Trek Costumes: 5 Decades of Fashion from the Final Frontier, and again I assume the quote is accurate. The key points of interest here are Captain Hornblower, the Prisoner of Zenda, and the desire for the uniforms to be more militaristic, in keeping with the nautical adventure tone. There was also the concept of space opera, made popular by the then concurrent Star Wars trilogy. In the Blu-ray special feature Designing Khan, Robert Fletcher said, "Nick Meyer was a very intellectual man who was extremely fond of opera, and he knew that I had designed a number of operas. Operas tend to be very full-blown and non-realistic and melodramatic, and so on and so forth, and I think that's very true of The Wrath of Khan. Except that nobody sang." The other major aspect of the uniforms to be revamped was the overall color palette. In William Shatner's book, Star Trek Movie Memories, producer Harve Bennett said, "The motion picture ended up looking as if it had been shot through gauze, and it took on a very sterile look. For me, that flew in the face of the vivid, oversaturated color and unrestrained exuberance of the original series. The best Star Trek adventures, as conceived, written, and photographed, couldn't help but come across as very alive, colorful, vibrant experiences." Shatner followed with, "Star Trek the Motion Picture was none of these things. It was muted, bland, shot in pastels, with crewmen in pale gray uniforms." In the aforementioned Blu-ray special feature Designing Khan, Robert Fletcher said, "Nick wanted something a little warmer, more military, less modernistic, or whatever word you might apply to the design of the first one. I went off to my tent and made new sketches, which were red and in a lot of different pieces, with many more emblems and badges. And in the aforementioned Cinema Fantastique, Robert Fletcher said, "The colors I wanted for the film are what I call corrupt colors, a shade off from a pure color. The uniform jackets aren't quite red. Everything is an ish color. Maroonish red, brownish green, purplish black. They're not colors you see today, so in a subtle way they indicate another time." I find it interesting that despite the criticism of the first movie's uniforms, many of the motion picture costumes were reused in The Wrath of Khan and the following movies, and nobody seemed to mind, or even notice. What's amazing to me is that Fletcher and his team managed to achieve an almost entirely new uniform aesthetic befitting the nautical adventure theme, while actually introducing very few new uniforms. The Wrath of Khan's much smaller budget may have required them to lean heavily on the existing, and generally unloved costumes from its predecessor, but modifying them and representing them in a new context that led to them becoming fan favorites was simply a work of creative genius. The Wrath of Khan era uniforms were even more complex than the motion picture, but by clever redesigns and clearer presentations, it's actually easier to follow along and make sense of it all. Instead of 4 uniform classes, each with multiple style and color variants, worn indiscriminately by all crew members, this was reduced to 2 primary uniforms, one for commissioned officers and one for enlisted personnel. There were still umpteen other uniforms and variants, but for the most part, everything was more clearly defined. So with all that in mind, let's dive in. In the original series, costume designer William Ware Tice had established 3 division colors. For the motion picture, Robert Fletcher expanded these to 6 colors, which were primarily shown by a small chest patch and/or shoulder tabs. These included white for command, orange for sciences, light green for medical, red for engineering, gold for operations, and gray for security. For The Wrath of Khan, he expanded this to include 7 colors and swapped a few around. He noted these and described exactly what each one represented in his costuming notes. The wearer's division was usually shown by a colored band on the lower left sleeve, as well as a right shoulder strap on the officers' uniforms and shoulder tabs on the enlisted crews. White remained the color for command, which included flag officers and captains. This also included enlisted crew members in leadership and/or management positions, although these were only seen on extras. Light green remained the color for the medical division. The other colors got shuffled around, though. Engineering was changed from red to gold. Gold also included helmsman, although curiously, this position was worn with operations gold in the motion picture. Apparently, helmsman was recategorized from operations to engineering for The Wrath of Khan. Gray was also changed from security in the motion picture to sciences in The Wrath of Khan. Apparently, communications was also reassigned from operations in the motion picture to sciences in The Wrath of Khan. Security was now represented with dark green. Light blue was for special services, an important but seldom seen color. Red, specifically flame red, was worn by cadets and trainees. Fletcher made the distinction that cadets were officers in training, while trainees were to become enlisted crew members. And finally, an 8th color was added to the lineup, not by Fletcher himself, but his successor, Nilo Rodis Jamero, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, for Star Trek V. This dark blue color was exclusively worn by extras during the rescue sequence in that movie. For decades, fans have debated exactly what this color represents, but personally, I just call this the Star Trek V Commando Blue. I do want to quickly point out a couple things about these colors. First, what we usually call white was, in fact, an off-white, cream color that only looked white in the finished movies. I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole since this video is only an overview, but I think it's important to mention that some of the specific hues of these colors changed over the years. The most obvious example is probably the engineering gold undershirts, which went from a dark warm gold to a lighter daffodil yellow color. Here's a comparison of Sulu's uniform in Star Trek III and Star Trek IV. And here's a Star Trek II publicity photo next to one for Star Trek IV. Science's gray is a bit more subjective considering how differently the movies were lit, to say nothing of post-production color editing, but it looked faintly warm gray in The Wrath of Khan, bluish gray in Star Trek III, neutral gray in Star Trek IV, and purplish gray in Star Trek VI. Here are 3 screen-used Uhura Division shirts, which are clearly different colors. For what it's worth, the screen-used Science's gray sleeve band I studied, and color-matched, was very close to the motion picture gray. As a side note, it's wild to me how blue the uniforms looked in the movie, compared to how absolutely neutral gray the fabric looks in person. We saw this effect with the motion picture uniforms too. I think this is why a lot of people seem to think the Science's gray was actually blue. On the whole, I think the Wrath of Khan era Division color palette was great, with mostly distinct colors. There's no confusing medical green with security green, or Special Services blue with Star Trek V Commando blue. However, if I were to offer any criticism, it would be that in a vacuum, the Science's gray and Special Services blue are maybe too easily confused with each other. Side by side, they're easy enough to tell apart, though. Here are 2 screen-used sleeve bands I was able to study in color match, thanks to Jonathan Janes. Here's an auction photo for 2 screen-used Division shirts, which I believe to be Special Services blue on the left and Science's gray on the right. And here's another side-by-side of 2 unrelated shirts, in which the difference is even easier to see. The Special Services blue color itself looks like it changed some too, from a more turquoisey blue in Star Trek III to a more grayish blue in Star Trek VI. The medical green looked pretty consistent to me across the movies, but strangely, the fabric color itself seems to have noticeably changed. But in a nutshell, those are the 8 Division colors of the era and what they represent. The most visually complex element of the Wrath of Khan era uniforms is probably the ranking system, along with the service pins. It's really a lot of bling. In the Blu-ray special feature Designing Khan, Robert Fletcher said, "When I first came in, there was no coherent schedule of ranks. You know, when you go into the Army or the Air Force or the Navy, you can buy a booklet, or find a booklet, that illustrates all of the known ranks, their various divisions, the way the Army or the service is organized, and the colors that are used, and so on and so forth. There was nothing really set about Star Trek, so I proceeded to write my own little manual, choosing the various symbols for the ranks and the badges, and it became kind of a game. It was fun to do. And questions would come from Trekkies about, what did this mean, and what did that mean? So I invented it, made it up right away, as if it was something that had been handed down to me. Well, it hadn't been handed down to me. I simply made it up. Gene Roddenberry was much more of a dreamer, a theoretician. He didn't like to get too closely connected to the nitty-gritty details about what anything means. In fact, he objected to too much militarism, and when I put more of it in, I don't think he was particularly pleased. I was really doing it more for the directors than for him. For The Wrath of Khan, Fletcher designed 2 sets of rank insignia, one for commissioned officers and another for enlisted personnel. Most uniforms had the wearer's rank on the lower left sleeve above the division band. Officers also wore a second rank insignia on their upper right shoulder strap. Here are his notes on the commissioned officer ranks. And here are some examples of the officer ranks in use, along with some close-up auction photos. Ensign, Lieutenant junior grade, Full Lieutenant, Lieutenant Commander, Full Commander, and Captain. I don't think we ever clearly saw a Commodore on screen, but there were at least a couple of these ranks made. It's possible they were used somewhere in the Star Trek IV Court Martial and or Star Trek VI Khitomer Peace Conference, but we never clearly saw them. Here's the Rear Admiral rank, Vice Admiral, Admiral, and Admiral of the Fleet, which I think is the same as Fleet Admiral, but I'm not sure. Again, in the Blu-ray special feature, Designing Khan, there's a diagram of these ranks, but unfortunately nearly all of them are wrong in relation to Fletcher's notes and what we actually saw in the movies themselves. Even though they're wrong, personally I find these flag officer ranks easier to tell apart. To me, the differences between the canon ones are too subtle for me to immediately identify. It sometimes takes me a few seconds to tell which is which. Also note that in this chart there's a rank for Fleet Captain, which, as best I can tell, is purely apocryphal. Enlisted crew members wore their rank insignia on the lower left sleeves as well, but they were seldom clearly visible in the movies. Here are Fletcher's notes on the enlisted rank insignia. And here are some close-up auction photos of each. This auction listing actually included a 7th item that may have also been some kind of enlisted rank insignia, second from the far right. Whatever this was, it doesn't seem to have been a one-off, because I found a second auction listing for another. Crew members also wore a variety of small pins on their lower left sleeve bands, which Fletcher called pips and squeaks. Here are his notes on these. The round ones were called pips and showed how long the wearer had served in Starfleet. Plain ones indicated 5 years, and he later added a variation with the Starfleet Delta on it that indicated 10 years. The longer pins were called squeaks and were commendations, although specifically for what is anyone's guess. Physically, these seem to have been identical for officers and enlisted crew, except officers wore gold and enlisted crew wore silver. The specific number of each obviously depended on the character, and their arrangement seems to have been left to the wearer's discretion. Admiral Kirk, Admiral Morrow, and the Saratoga captain alternated theirs. Dr. McCoy, Uhura, and Admiral Cartwright alternated theirs in a different pattern. Spock, Scotty, Chekhov, and Esteban arranged theirs symmetrically, with the squeaks centered and pips to the sides, and Sulu arranged his asymmetrically. The primary new addition to the uniform lineup was for the main cast, which by default became the commissioned officers' uniforms. These were also worn by cadets. Compared to a lot of the other movie-era uniforms, very few of these were actually made, but they had such a strong presence, and were so darn cool, that they became fan favorites, often referred to as the Monster Maroons. Obviously, these uniforms deserve their own deep dive, which I definitely intend to do, but our purpose here is to look at how they fit into the larger whole. It's with these uniforms that the aforementioned influences are easiest to see. The Prisoner of Zenda, for example. And of course, Captain Hornblower. I dare say the Star Wars movies may have been somewhat influential too. These were 3-piece uniform ensembles, a maroon wool jacket and black wool trousers, worn with division-colored undershirts made of lightweight spandex. The jacket fabric weave was seldom visible on camera, even in remastered HD, but it was actually an interesting fabric called cavalry twill that has a distinct, strong diagonal weave. In his notes, Fletcher wrote that the jackets were wool elastique. The two fabrics are indeed very similar, to the point that the terms are often used interchangeably, but they are subtly different fabrics. A metal badge was worn on the upper left chest, in the shape of the TMP-style Starfleet Delta, but with a new backing added. They were also worn with black leather belts, with the buckle being another metal bronze Starfleet Delta enclosed in a large ring. On the upper right of the jacket was a division-colored shoulder strap, which also featured the wearer's rank insignia. We've already discussed the division colors, but there were a couple variations Fletcher mentioned in his notes. First, department heads had the option of wearing division-colored shoulder straps and sleeve bands with white stripes, or white shoulder straps and sleeve bands with division-colored stripes. Here are some auction photos of these elements. As captain of engineering, Scotty would have this option, but he exercised it differently. In Star Trek 4 through 6, he wore solid gold with his standard uniform, but he wore a command white division shirt with his engineering vest. He wore an engineering gold division shirt with his bomber jacket in Star Trek 3, but he switched to command white for Star Trek 4. Maybe it took a little while for him to get used to the rank of captain? According to Fletcher's notes, Starfleet Academy instructors wore white shoulder straps and sleeve bands with red slashes. And finally, cadets wore red shoulder straps and sleeve bands, but the sleeve bands also had slashes in their intended division color. On the back of these shoulder straps was a small silver gizmo, which Fletcher referred to in his notes as a security clearance device. Its purpose, as Fletcher described it, allows its wearer free access to locked and restricted areas for which he has been specifically authorized. Consequently, not all these electronic decoding keys are the same shape. Here's a closer look at some of the various devices used. There were probably others used as well, but these are just some of the ones I've seen. Their corresponding security levels, hierarchy, etc. weren't defined in either the movies themselves or in Fletcher's notes, so they're left to our interpretations. How they actually worked is also left to our imagination. It could be a tracking device, ensuring the wearer doesn't go anywhere they're not authorized. It could be a sort of 23rd century key card, prompting doors to open and/or force fields to deactivate whenever someone wearing the device is approaching. Or it could be like an electronic dog collar, zapping the wearer whenever they try to go somewhere they shouldn't. It's probably not that though. And since these devices were only seen on the standard officers' uniforms, how officers wearing other uniforms and enlisted personnel were supposed to get into restricted areas is, again, left to our imagination. Regardless of how they worked or their intended associations, they definitely added some visual interest to the back of the uniform, which was something Fletcher excelled at doing. These jackets closed up the right front by a series of small black snaps. In between the snaps were decorative lengths of silver chain. The chain was added to basically make the area less boring and ordinary looking. In the aforementioned September 2002 issue of Star Trek the Magazine, Fletcher said, "In order to make it look less like plain old snaps, I found this sterling silver chain that looked strange. I ordered a reel of it and sewed it in the snaps to give it a feeling that it was perhaps a magnetic closing." In my opinion, this was another stroke of brilliance on Fletcher's part. Even though the jackets were usually worn fully closed, hints of the chain could be seen sparkling from underneath, adding an element of charm and mystique to them. When the jackets were worn with the flap undone, the area was definitely more visually interesting with the chain. Unfortunately, there wasn't always enough chain for every uniform, particularly into the later movies and TV series, and the upper area of the jacket didn't look nearly as interesting without the chain. The jacket overlap was faced with a contrasting fabric. Captains and flag officers had white flaps, while everyone else's jackets had tan flaps. The women's jackets had princess seams on the front. However, the men's jackets had fitting darts beneath the chest. Both the men's and women's jackets had princess seams along the side back, which were accented by black piping sewn into the seams. With all that in mind, there were several variations of these jackets. Standard officers' jackets, from ensign up to captain, had plain black trim along the right overlap. However, flag officers' jackets had gold soutache accenting the edge of the black trim. In his notes, Fletcher didn't make any distinction between the specific admiral ranks in relation to the soutache, but there were a few variations that are open to interpretation. At first, in Star Trek II and Star Trek III, it looks like all admiral jackets just had the one narrow band of gold soutache. In Star Trek IV, Admiral Cartwright, who was the same rank as Admiral Morrow was in Star Trek III, had two adjacent rows of gold soutache on his jacket. Same thing for Harve Bennett's cameo in Star Trek V, although I think he was just wearing Admiral Cartwright's jacket from Star Trek IV. Then in Star Trek VI, things really got confusing. We saw a full admiral wearing a jacket with only one row of soutache, which I guess was fine. Then we saw another Admiral of the Fleet, the same rank as Admirals Morrow and Cartwright, with two rows of soutache slightly separated. We might interpret this as a specific distinction for the Starfleet C&C, but Admiral Morrow's uniform didn't have the second band in Star Trek III. And of course, there was the whole Colonel thing, which I honestly think was just a mistake, and whether or not it's even in the movie depends on which version you're watching. So I think we can safely surmise that Commodore, which we never clearly saw, Rear Admiral, Vice Admiral, Admiral, and Colonel all had one band of soutache. But we saw one band of soutache on Fleet Admiral Morrow, two adjacent bands of soutache on Fleet Admiral Cartwright, and two separated bands of soutache on Fleet Admiral Smiley. At least two of those three were Starfleet C&C at the time. In the Star Trek IV novelization, Admiral Cartwright was C&C, but it's up to you whether or not to accept that as canon. Like I said, this is apparently open to interpretation. Mine is that Fletcher's original intent was for all admirals to have one band of soutache. Then things started going off the rails a bit from Star Trek IV onward. Flag officers also wore distinctive braid on their lower left sleeves, in between their sleeve bands and rank insignia. In The Wrath of Khan, this was a narrow band of black and gold checkered trim. However, from Star Trek III onward, this was changed to a more ornate, colorful trim. Here are Fletcher's notes on the Admiral sleeve braid from Star Trek III onward. And here are some close-up auction photos of these Admiral braids. There is also this braid with 5 lozenges, which Fletcher didn't mention in his notes. During the court-martial near the end of Star Trek IV, multiple Starfleet officers, at least most of them, or maybe all of them, admirals, were seen wearing a large UFP badge on their upper front chests. In his notes, Fletcher simply described this as United Federation of Planets badge. My personal interpretation is that these were worn by members of the Federation Council. In Star Trek VI, flag officers wore award ribbons on their upper left chest, beneath the standard Starfleet chest badge. Curiously, the lady who introduced the CNC did too, even though she wasn't a flag officer. Anyway, these awards were also seen during the Generations prologue, which makes sense. In Star Trek III, this lady's jacket had epaulettes, and she wore a gold rope around her left shoulder. In Star Trek V, we saw something similar, but this lady's jacket didn't have the epaulettes. And in Star Trek IV, this guy wore white gloves with his jacket. Honestly, I don't know what any of these mean. I just wanted to mention them as points of interest. Another jacket variant was worn with these alternate chest badges in the Starfleet Academy video game by Interplay. Another neat thing about these jackets is that although they were usually worn fully closed, there were a couple other wearing styles. For a less formal or less proper look, the wearer could undo the upper right closures and let the flap drape down. This could help visually represent a variety of emotional states. When circumstances allowed, Uhura liked to wear her jacket with both upper edges open and draping downward, like lapels. Underneath the jacket, officers wore division-colored turtleneck-style undershirts. These were made of lightweight spandex, dull side out. Both the collars and sleeve cuffs were quilted, using a technique called trapunto. These undershirts closed up the back by a lapped zipper. The zipper actually separated, like a jacket zipper. The black trousers were made in a wide variety of ways. Some were a little more than pajama pants, while others were well-fitted and tailored. These were usually made of wool, but some were made of heavy jumbo spandex. A distinctive trait they pretty much all had in common was their exaggerated bell-bottom silhouette, with extra pant leg fullness beneath the knees gathered down toward the ankle. Sometimes this fullness was elasticized down into a stretchy cuff of black knit fabric, other times it was gathered or pleated down into the cuff. These trousers were high-waisted, at least by modern standards, extending up to the wearer's natural waist. Some trousers had a cut-on waistband. It's my personal opinion that these are the ideal standard. Other trousers had separate sewn-on waistbands, though. Most of the trousers had standard front zipper flies. These trousers also had a narrow band of division-colored fabric along the sides of the pant legs. The one exception was the command division, which had red stripes on the pant legs, matching the jacket fabric, instead of white. Flag officers had a wider red stripe with gold soutache added. According to Fletcher's notes, Commodores up to admirals had a single band of soutache. Admirals of the fleet had 2 bands of soutache. In Star Trek VI, the CNC had 3 bands of soutache on his pant legs. Fletcher made no mention of this in his notes and wasn't the costume designer for that movie anyway, so I think this was a later addition specifically for that position. There were a couple weird variations of these trousers. Some had extra seams and a strangely positioned side front zipper. Also note that the trousers in the right 3 photos didn't have a waistband at all. The upper edge was just overlocked. I think these must have been for extras and or stunt use. And for the stunt work in Generations, there was an overall style attachment that prevented any unwelcome peekaboo from underneath the vest. You wouldn't be able to tell that these weren't the standard uniform trousers in the finished movies, but I wanted to quickly mention them as points of interest. An alternative to the standard uniform trousers was a skirt, which was mainly, possibly exclusively, worn by Uhura. She wore this for some Star Trek III publicity photos. I'm not sure she ever actually wore it in the movie itself, though. The only time we clearly saw her legs, she was wearing the standard trousers. The rest of the time, only the upper part of her body was actually in the frame. It's possible she wore the skirt for the transporter room scene with Mr. Adventure and or on Vulcan, but we never got a good enough look. She also wore the standard trousers in Star Trek IV. The first time I can confirm she definitely wore the skirt was in Star Trek V. I think she wore it for the entire movie, except for when she wore the field uniform. Or nothing? She also wore it in the cast publicity photos for that movie. She wore the skirt for all of Star Trek VI as well. There was an auction listing for one of these skirts, but it had the wider red stripe and gold soutache for flag officers. The only times I can think of that this would have been used was on one of the lady admirals in the early briefing scene, or possibly at the Khitomer Peace Conference. As originally designed, the Monster Maroon jackets were fairly short. The jacket hem was usually about the same length as the sleeves. Some, like Chekhov's, were actually a little shorter. They were consistently about this length all the way through Star Trek VI. However, for generations, costume designer Robert Blackman noticeably lengthened the original cast members' jackets, particularly Kirk's and Scotty's. Chekhov's looked a bit longer too, but not as much as Kirk's and Scotty's. It's probably easiest to see how much longer the jackets were in these two publicity photos. If you want to learn more about how these uniforms evolved into the Lost era and transitioned into the TNG era uniforms, check out this other video here on my channel. By far the most common uniforms during the Wrath of Khan era were those worn by enlisted personnel. The Monster Maroons were newly made for the movie and are, of course, well loved by fans, and deservedly so. But to me, what Fletcher and his team accomplished with the enlisted uniforms is even more impressive. These began their lives as the motion picture Class D jumpsuits, but they were overdyed to a new color and heavily modified to the extent that they were virtually unrecognizable. In my opinion, this is a perfect example of economic filmmaking. Resourcefulness met with creative genius channeled toward revision while tempered by frugality. Transforming a wardrobe of generally unloved costumes into fan favorites is nothing short of costuming alchemy, turning lemons into lemonade, as it were. In the aforementioned book, The Making of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan by Alan Asherman, producer Robert Sallin said, "One of the first things we had to do for Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan was redesign the entire wardrobe. I knew we couldn't afford to do all the wardrobe over again, so I got Bob Fletcher to run some dye tests to find out what colors the uniforms from Star Trek the Motion Picture would take successfully. We ended up with 3 colors, a gold, a blue-gray, and the wine color that we ultimately settled on. And Fletcher, who's a wonderful talent, added things and changed things, including the tightness of the fit. He said, yes, I can loosen this, drop that. I suggested blousing the trousers and adding the stripes. In so doing, we were able to modify and reuse much of the previous wardrobe for the cadets' uniforms." For clarity, I just want to point out that he incorrectly referred to the enlisted crew uniforms as cadets' uniforms, which is a common misconception we'll get to shortly. There were probably more enlisted jumpsuits made than any other uniform of the era, probably because of the massive head start the existing TMP jumpsuits gave the costuming department. In most group shots of Starfleet crew members, the majority of extras would be wearing these. As you can see, they blended right in with the new Monster Maroons perfectly and were clearly part of the same uniform family, while being unmistakably different. The most memorable characters to wear these were probably the 2 assassins in Star Trek VI. The great James Horner also had a cameo in The Wrath of Khan wearing this uniform. Enlisted crew had a variety of jobs, like blowing the whistle to announce the arrival of important figures. They did the cooking. They apparently did a lot of the physical labor, like preparing the photon torpedo launchers. During the Star Trek VI investigation, enlisted crew members seem to have done most of the actual hunting. They may have filled in for officers in key bridge stations as needed, too. In Star Trek II, the Enterprise pilot and navigator were both officers, or 1 officer and 1 cadet, depending on how you regard the rank of lieutenant junior grade. In Star Trek III, after Savik's departure, an enlisted crew member took over as navigator, which I'd accept since even if it was normally an officer's position, the Enterprise probably only had a skeleton crew on board by that point. Assuming the bridge stations had the same functions, we saw the reverse situation on the Excelsior, which was piloted by an enlisted crew member while the navigator was an officer. We saw this again on the Grissom, although that crew member was curiously wearing Science's gray, or possibly Special Services blue. It was really hard to tell them apart in Star Trek III. Starfleet training is extremely thorough, so I think we can safely assume all Starfleet personnel, officers and enlisted alike, have at least a basic proficiency at every station. And I obviously have no issue with enlisted crew members manning key bridge stations like helm and navigation. I'm just not sure what the rhyme or reason was. In any event, in Star Trek IV, there was one enlisted lady who was also a member of the Federation Council. Good for her. I think that might have actually been Grace Lee Whitney. Some sources say it was, others don't. I honestly can't really tell. As I mentioned earlier, it's a common misconception that cadets wore these jumpsuits and switched to the Monster Maroons once they graduated. The jumpsuits had quilted collars and cuffs, analogous to those on the division-colored undershirts worn by officers. Enlisted personnel always had black collars and cuffs. However, enlisted trainees had red collars and cuffs. Here's an enlisted trainee wearing the jumpsuit near a cadet wearing the Monster Maroon. I think part of the confusion may have come from the Starfleet Academy video game from back in the day. At the very least, it perpetuated this misconception. The characters in the game were referred to and addressed as cadets, even though they were incorrectly dressed in the standard enlisted jumpsuits from the movies. The main characters switched to the aforementioned Monster Maroon variant for the commencement ceremony at the end, but then switched back to the enlisted jumpsuits to embark on their mission.
This doesn't make sense.
I'd buy that the enlisted uniforms became the cadet and or trainee uniforms at some point during the Lost era as the Starfleet uniforms evolved, but the game is set between Star Trek V and Star Trek VI, so even that headcanon goes out the window. Maybe the game was fun? I don't know, I missed out on this one growing up. But honestly, the uniforms were just a mess. Sulu was clearly referred to as captain, but wore his gold division colors and commander rank insignia. The overall vibe I got just watching the gameplay footage for costume research was that some people who barely knew anything about Robert Fletcher's uniforms just did their best. Both the enlisted trainees and crew members wore division-colored shoulder tabs, which were another echo of the motion picture uniforms. These shoulder tabs were made of division-colored wool gabardine over a black felt base. In the motion picture, these shoulder tabs also showed the wearer's rank, mostly using the same schema seen in the series. On the enlisted jumpsuits, though, the shoulder tabs were plain, except for when they accidentally made their way onto film, such as in this shot from Star Trek VI. Instead, the rank insignia was worn on the lower left sleeve, above a division-colored sleeve band, just like on the officers' jackets. Like the cadets, trainees wore red sleeve bands with division-colored slashes. And like the officers, enlisted crew members in leadership or managerial positions had the option of wearing a white stripe on their sleeve bands. Being repurposed motion picture jumpsuits, these enlisted jumpsuits were made of heavy jumbo spandex, sewn with the dull side out, although some faint sparkling could occasionally be seen. In these close-up auction photos, the jumbo spandex weave is more clearly visible. Unlike their TMP predecessors, though, a contrasting beige yoke with decorative black piping was added to the jumpsuit. A metal chest badge, the shape of the Starfleet Delta, similar to the officers minus the oblong backing, was worn on the upper left chest. These jumpsuits were generally very tight and had top stitching along the side front and side back seams in a contrasting lighter thread color. Black stripes were added to the sides of the body and the undersides of the sleeves. A decorative panel was also added to the center back, adding more visual interest while also hiding the zipper. Like their predecessors, these uniforms had a patch pocket attached to the right hip, a rarity for Star Trek costumes. The enlisted jumpsuits were worn with belts, technically unnecessary for a jumpsuit, but I think these accomplished two things. First, they helped make the enlisted uniforms look more analogous to the officers. Second, and on a more practical level, they hid the front waist seams that were covered by the perscan devices in the motion picture. These belts seem to have been identical to the ones worn by the officers, except the enlisted crew had silver belt buckles. As you can see, a pair of belt loops was added to the jumpsuit to hold the belt in place. Since these were repurposed motion picture jumpsuits, they had the lower front pant leg panel inserts that formed a sort of inverted box pleat. On some jumpsuits, these pleats were closed at the bottom like they were on the motion picture uniforms, but on others they were pulled open, probably an attempt to widen the pant leg and achieve the bell-bottom effect similar to the officers' trousers. Some of the TMP uniforms had attached shoes, but the enlisted jumpsuits were worn with black boots. There were also these shoes, which were production-made, or rather modified, but I don't think they ever wound up being used in the movies. In Star Trek VI, a name tag was added to the wearer's upper right chest. Like the Flag Officer's Awards, these enlisted name tags continued to be used in the Generations prologue. Another minor variant of these uniforms was seen throughout the aforementioned Starfleet Academy video game, in which the cadets wore squeaks on their collars. It was never addressed or explained in the game, but I think this was probably intended to be a nod to how the TNG era cadets wore elongated pips on their collars that indicated the current year of their academy training. For context, the video game was released in 1997, several years after The Next Generation had ended. In addition to the standard officer and enlisted uniforms, there were multiple other uniform garments and options, usually for specific departments or situations. Most of these were again recycled from the motion picture, although they were modified to varying degrees. For example, the engineering radiation suits were originally from the motion picture and continued to be used throughout all of the following TOS movies. We did a deep dive of these a while back on my blog when I had the opportunity to study a screen-used costume. I also discussed these at length in a corresponding video here on the channel, so I won't rehash everything here. For now, I'll just say that some of the finer detailing was changed from the motion picture to The Wrath of Khan. Officers and enlisted crew wore black collars and tubing, while trainees wore red collars and tubing. There were also orange variants of these, which Fletcher mentioned as being emergency/fire suits on his costume sketch. These were usually in the background, but they finally got their moment in Star Trek IV when a team of them rushed in to brace the window. In Star Trek III, we saw these orange variants worn with trainee red collars. It makes sense that emergency personnel would need to go through some training first. In Star Trek VI, name tags were added to these, just like they were with the enlisted jumpsuits. The assassins wore these when they boarded the Klingon ship, but with new helmets, and of course the magnetic gravity boots. All told, I counted 11 variants of these over the course of the movies, so check out my post and video about these if you're interested in learning more about them. Another departmental uniform recycled from the motion picture, and modified a bit, was for medical personnel. The most obvious change was that in The Wrath of Khan, they were worn with the medical green division shirt underneath. This made the previously two-piece wool uniform a three-piece ensemble with the undershirt. The green caduceus was a patch in the motion picture, but it was swapped out for a more elaborate badge in The Wrath of Khan. The wearer's rank and division were shown on the lower left sleeve, just as with all the aforementioned uniforms. Like in the motion picture, there were two variations of these. The version worn by Dr. McCoy had an open front and rounded collar. The other version had raglan sleeves, a closed upper front, and an open neckline with no collar. My interpretation of this is that the collared versions were for doctors, and the other versions were for other medical staff, such as nurses and technicians. As best I can tell, these were worn with white boots in the movie. However, it's possible some of the TMP trousers with attached shoes were worn by some background extras. Another uniform modified and reused from the motion picture was for security guards. Aside from the obvious color change, like the medical uniforms, these were worn with the security green division shirt underneath. The wearer's rank and division were again added to the lower left sleeve. Security green stripes were also added to the pant legs. In the motion picture, Fletcher reintroduced the notion of field jackets, which hadn't been seen since The Cage. He revisited the idea again with The Wrath of Khan, but this time he designed new field jackets from scratch instead of just reusing the ones from the motion picture. With these, we can again see some influence from The Prisoner of Zenda. The TMP field jackets actually had quite a bit of detailing, but they were mostly unicolor. The Wrath of Khan field jackets were deep and rich in color, with contrasting collars and quilted panels, fabric straps, pockets, and lots of bling. The Monster Maroons have the reputation of being challenging to make, but in my opinion, these field jackets are the real monsters, possibly the most intricate and ornate uniform garments in all of Star Trek. Some echoes of the motion picture field jackets did make it into their Wrath of Khan successors, such as the large lower front pockets and decorative cording along the sleeves. Like on the motion picture field jackets, there was a division-colored band on the upper left sleeve, but instead of showing the wearer's rank, it had the wearer's pips and squeaks. Above that, a large circular patch was added that showed our solar system, with Earth highlighted in blue. I think it's open to interpretation whether this was the wearer's home planet or current assignment, since Savik's patch had Earth instead of Vulcan, Romulus, or Pandora. The outer edge of the patch was accented in the wearer's division color. These patches were yet another brilliantly economical repurposing of the Earth-based patches seen in the motion picture, saving production time and money while also providing a subtle sense of visual continuity. Unlike most of the other uniform garments of the era, the wearer's rank insignia was on the lower right sleeve. These field jackets were worn in place of the usual monster maroon jackets, rather than over them, with the standard undershirts and trousers. With one exception, these were the only characters we ever saw wearing these field jackets, so how enlisted personnel would wear these, or what they would wear at all on landing parties, is left to our imagination. The exception I mentioned was Dr. Carol Marcus, who wore Kirk's field jacket on the bridge during the movie's climax. The field jacket actually had more screen time in Star Trek III. Saavik wore it from when she and David first beamed down to Genesis all the way through the very end of the movie. These were only seen in Star Trek II and Star Trek III, except for a brief moment in Star Trek VI when we saw one hanging in Kirk's closet. In addition to the field jackets, there were two field vests seen in the movies. The first was worn by Kirk while they were seemingly stranded on the asteroid. He'd taken off his field jacket and Chekhov was using it as a blanket through his conversation with Carol Marcus and during the Kobayashi Maru discussion in the Genesis cave. He wore this when they all beamed back to the Enterprise, then he immediately changed back into the standard duty uniform. The other field vest we saw was worn by Saavik in Star Trek III, usually under her field jacket. She also wore it in a couple Star Trek III publicity photos. Unfortunately, very little detailing could clearly be seen about these in either movie, although we do know Kirk's was fabric, but Saavik's was leather. Here are a couple interesting auction photos of the detailing on Saavik's vest. I think it's open to interpretation whether this was a gender difference, a situational or environmental difference, up to the wearer's personal preference, or other possible explanation. Another, more casual-looking alternative to the standard uniform jacket is usually referred to by fans as the bomber jacket. These were very rare, and as best I can tell, they were only ever worn by three characters: Admiral Morrow in Star Trek III, Scotty in Star Trek III and Star Trek IV, and Kirk in Star Trek V. We first saw these in Star Trek III when Kirk met with Admiral Morrow to ask for permission to return to the Genesis planet. Scotty changed into his when he reported to the Excelsior. He continued to wear it from the hijacking of the Enterprise to the very end of the movie. He wore it on and off throughout Star Trek IV, first on Vulcan and then for his excursion into the past San Francisco. Then in Star Trek V, Kirk wore it when he arrived back on the Enterprise and for a while afterward as they got underway. These suede jackets had shawl collars and closed up the front by a series of snaps. On the right was a decorative division-colored shoulder strap similar to that on the Monster Maroon jackets. The wearer's rank was displayed on the lower front of the strap. Like most of the other uniforms of the era, the wearer's rank was also shown on the lower left sleeve, above a division-colored sleeve band. Both Admiral Morrow and Captain Kirk displayed their pips and squeaks on their sleeve bands, just like on the standard uniform jackets. For some reason, though, Scotty didn't. For what it's worth, I think for Star Trek V, Admiral Morrow's jacket was reused for Kirk. Note the gold soutache along Morrow's shoulder strap, which I assume would have only accented flag officers' uniforms, like on the standard Monster Maroon jackets. Scotty was a captain and wore captain rank insignia, but his jacket didn't have the gold soutache, so I think this was just a production mistake. Another alternative to the standard uniform jacket was an engineering vest, which Scotty wore throughout most of the latter three movies. I call it the engineering vest because that's my interpretation of what I believe it was. Scotty was the only character we ever saw wearing it. He was the chief engineer, and it had what looked like little pockets and pouches for tools. We first saw this in Star Trek IV. At first he wore it underneath his bomber jacket. Once they were underway, he ditched the jacket and just wore the vest while he was on board the ship. This seems to have immediately become his favorite outfit. He wore it every chance he got for the rest of Star Trek IV and the following two movies. He wore the standard Monster Maroon uniform for the trial at the end of the movie and for the shuttle trip up to the new Enterprise, although with the incorrect rank of commander instead of captain. This was almost definitely a production mistake, but we hadn't seen him in this uniform since he was promoted, so I like to think Scotty just grumpily pulled it out of his closet for the trial and wore it with the commander rank still attached, out of spite. In Star Trek V, he wore the vest for almost the entire movie. He only put on his standard uniform jacket for the reception with the Klingons at the end. He did wear the jacket for these Star Trek V publicity photos, though, and with the proper captain rank. He wore his monster maroon jacket for the briefing scene near the beginning of Star Trek VI, but then he ditched it and switched to his preferred vest as soon as they were on board the Enterprise and underway. He put the standard jacket back on for the dinner with the Klingons, probably swearing under his breath as he did so, then immediately changed back out of it again afterward. He wore the vest for most of the rest of the movie, all the way through the space battle with the Klingons. Despite the urgency of the situation, he took the time to toss the jacket back on to beam down and save the peace conference. As soon as they were back on the ship, though, it was back to the vest. I bet he had it in the transporter room waiting for him. In my opinion, it really became his signature look through the later movies. He even wore it for many of the Star Trek VI publicity photos. Naturally, when he showed up in the TNG episode Relics, this was his outfit. I have no evidence of this, but I've always thought that the red fabric he used for his sling was the same fabric as the Monster Maroon jackets, suggesting that he quickly ripped one down into some long strips to use as some emergency first aid for his arm. One difference for his TNG appearance was that he wore the vest unzipped. This could have been a costuming choice, emotionally representing that his character was on his way to retirement and no longer an active Starfleet engineer. Or, if we're honest, it could have simply been because the vest wouldn't actually close at that point. Just keeping it real. Anyway, once he was cleaned up, he didn't change into the current Starfleet uniform, but a fresher version of the one he was already wearing. However, he did swap out his older Wrath of Khan era chest badge for a TNG era communicator. It was a great episode, but I do wish we would have seen him with the vest zip closed again at the end. I think this would have visually reinforced this step in his character's arc, that he again had a sense of purpose and wouldn't be retiring after all. He did show up one more time in Generations, wearing the standard Monster Maroon jacket, and doesn't he just look so happy to be wearing it again? There were a couple more uniforms added to the uniform family by Robert Fletcher's successors later on. Star Trek V was the first movie in the franchise without Fletcher as the costume designer. For that movie, the role went to Nilo Rodis-Jamero. Again, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who designed new field uniforms for the Nimbus 3 rescue mission. Like I mentioned earlier, I refer to these as commando uniforms to avoid confusion with the Star Trek II and III field jackets and their corresponding vests. It's possible Starfleet had retired those field uniforms in favor of these, or that they remained in use concurrently. For these, Nilo Rodis-Jamero clearly drew inspiration from then-familiar British military uniforms. These were three-piece uniforms, a heavy knit sweater worn with a standard division shirt, and a variation of the standard uniform trousers. The sweaters actually began their lives as existing woolly-pulley sweaters, which were modified for the movie. Among other changes, a division-colored sleeve band was added to the lower left sleeve, in keeping with the theme Robert Fletcher had established. However, the wearer's rank was worn directly on the sleeve band instead of above it, and there were no pips and squeaks on these. The main cast all wore their standard division-colored undershirts and belts with these uniforms. The extras all wore commando blue undershirts and did not wear belts. Captain Kirk wore a grayish version of this uniform, while all the other characters wore tan. These commando uniforms were also worn with new boots. These boots at least began their lives as Reeboks, although I can't say to what extent they were or weren't modified for production. One final addition to the uniform family was made by Robert Blackman for Captain Kirk's appearance in Generations, a simple but dignified vest. We first saw him wearing this vest when his character was reintroduced in the Nexus. His Monster Maroon jacket was also in the frame, which to me implied two things: that Kirk had taken off his jacket to chop wood, and that the vest itself was worn under the jacket. The idea of the captain having a vest option that was also worn underneath their standard uniform jacket was an idea that Blackman followed up on in the next movie and on Deep Space Nine. Of course, the real reason for this vest was probably because the Monster Maroons look beautiful but aren't very practical, particularly for rough and tumble action. Shatner and his stuntmen would need their full mobility for the character's final fight on Veridian 3. This vest had red panels on the front and back with black panels on the sides. These black side panels had a slimming effect, something Blackman brought from his experience on TNG with William Ware Tice's original designs for that show. The vest was worn with the Wrath of Khan era chest badge. The red panels of the vest were made from cavalry twill, presumably the same as the Monster Maroon jackets, but the black side panels were made of jumbo spandex. If you look carefully, the black spandex on the sides of the vest don't quite match the black wool trousers. The zipper pull was a small, round gold piece, very similar to the pips that Fletcher had originally designed. Believe it or not, there were even more uniforms seen in these movies, which I'll quickly mention because they were barely seen. This particular uniform was another direct reuse from the motion picture. I believe it was for janitors. There was one outside the Kobayashi Maru simulator room in The Wrath of Khan. One walked by as the crew was preparing for the upcoming battle in the nebula, and there were a couple in the lineup for Spock's funeral near the end of the movie. We also saw one in Star Trek III working on the starbase as the Enterprise was being stolen. For the motion picture, there was a range of costumes made that may or may not have been uniforms. In his costume sketch, Robert Fletcher listed this as being a lounge suit, and most auction listings for these have described them as off-duty attire. Whatever they were originally designed for, in The Wrath of Khan, Saavik wore one of these during the turbolift scene with Kirk. Because she wore it with a metal Starfleet chest badge, I wanted to mention it as a potential uniform, possibly for exercise or some kind of training we didn't see. In Star Trek III, we briefly saw these uniforms, which were different from the ones worn by regular security guards. My interpretation is that these were prison guards. Fletcher did mention some things to this effect in his notes, the details of which seem to match these. These were two-piece bluish-gray wool uniforms, with security green collars, stripes along the shoulders, and upper sleeves. They also had security green stripes down the pant legs, like the standard black officer's trousers. What doesn't make sense to me is that despite all the security green accents, both of the guards we saw appear to have had division-colored sleeve bands, which were trainee red with a matching bluish-gray stripe, implying they were sciences or special services cadets. They did have some freaking amazing sleeve cuffs though, so I'm willing to look past the confusion this time. These were unique in that they were actually worn with hats, which had a variation of the motion picture Earth-based patches that were also reused on the field jackets. Another obscure but fun uniform was for the waiters, briefly seen in the background when Kirk met with Morrow. One walked right by the camera for the opening shot of the scene, then they just went about their business while the two talked. We didn't get to see much of them in the movie, but thanks to some auction photos, we can see that these were spandex jumpsuits, actually very similar to the enlisted jumpsuits, but with a Special Services blue front panel, collar, and sleeve cuffs similar to those on the officers' undershirts. There was a large patch on the upper left sleeve, which was another clever reuse of the motion picture Earth-based patches. These were accented with the Special Services blue division color. A new Starfleet waiter uniform was introduced in Star Trek VI, first seen in the background during the dinner with the Klingons. They briefly showed up again later in the movie, and we could see that they were actually very similar to the Star Trek V commando uniforms. The main differences seem to have been that these were black, worn with belts, and a metal Starfleet Delta badge on the upper left shoulder panel, had some Special Services blue accents added to the upper armscye, and had no division bands on the sleeves. And finally, in Star Trek VI, some Starfleet issue sleepwear was also introduced, primarily seen on Captain Sulu when Christian Slater woke him up, and on a few Enterprise crew members during the intercom announcement summoning the court reporter to sickbay. These appear to have been t-shirt and boxer shorts made with cream-colored fabrics. The t-shirts were made with a netted fabric, but the boxer shorts were probably a solid knit fabric. There was a small triangle on the upper left chest with the Starfleet Delta symbol, along with the ship's name and registry. Strangely, Captain Sulu's sleep shirt didn't have this. On one shirt, the USS Excelsior text was blacked out, probably with a marker or maybe some paint. This looks like it was done for this Enterprise crew member's shirt, presumably to avoid having to make a separate patch, or set of patches, for Enterprise sleepwear. Although I do wonder why the NCC 2000 wasn't blotted out as well. Robert Fletcher established a richly detailed uniform paradigm for these movies, with a variety of uniform options and variants for different departments and situations, many of which have become well-loved and even fan favorites. Aside from the sheer volume of amazing costumes, I find it particularly impressive that so much of it was done with an astonishing amount of forethought and planning. When you consider the 8 division colors and optional stripes along with the 17 different ranks, that's a total of 1,904 possible combinations on almost every uniform. He truly made the most of the smaller budget for the Wrath of Khan. At no point do the costumes ever come across as cheap, or just lazy recycles. I think most fans would agree that the Wrath of Khan is even more visually interesting and saturated than its predecessor. Fletcher's creative genius was on full display throughout these movies, and I think his successors were wise to stick pretty closely to what he'd established, even while making their own changes and contributions. The costuming wizardry he and his team accomplished not only brought us an era of iconic costumes, but helped bring us a series of classic movies which continue to stand the test of time and are still enjoyed by countless fans.
I don't get out very much.